I'm Stephanie Mortis-Stevens, Assistant Editor at Trinity University Press. Thank you for joining us tonight for the Maverick Book Club. As a nonprofit cultural and educational publisher, we are committed to an evolving agenda of work that engages, questions, and brings us together as a community in effective and productive ways. The discussion tonight is on Faultlines, Portraits of East Austin by John Langmore. Faultlines features more than 100 color and black and white photographs of Austin, Texas, taken between 2006 and 2011, during which time Langmore was fully aware that the window for capturing the historic East Austin community was rapidly closing. Our conversation tonight is with Langmore, joined by activist Bertha Rendón Delgado and Austin historian Harrison Eppright, moderated by journalist Michael King. They will be discussing the tensions over gentrification in one of the country's fastest growing cities, the importance of preserving and honoring the past, and the legacy that Austin might lose in racing towards its future. Now, I would like to introduce Michael King, who will be leading our conversation tonight. Michael, who wrote the foreword to Faultlines, is a former news editor and staff writer at the Austin Chronicle, and previously the editor of the Texas Observer. He remains a contributing writer at the Austin Chronicle and has written for The Baffler, among other publications. Thank you all for joining us tonight. If you would like to purchase a copy of Faultlines, visit us at tupress.org and use the promo code Maverick04, that's Maverick and the numbers 04, at checkout for 20% off. A portion of the proceeds of these books from tonight's event goes to support local Austin neighborhood nonprofits. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. And thanks to Trinity University Press for putting this together and having this discussion of John's book. I should note at the outset that folks are invited to submit questions either through the Q&A or the chat feature on their Zoom, and I'll try to keep up with them and take as many as we can. But before I get to that, I want to introduce our panelists in a little more detail. Obviously, John is with us, and I'll have a little bit more to say about him in a minute, but I want to talk about the other two guests first. Bertha Rendón Delgado is a communications consultant in Austin, better known as a longtime community activist, an organizer and a leader in the East Austin Chicano community. She is the founder and CEO of a cultural legacy organization, Arte Texas, a founder and chair of the Save East Austin Schools Coalition, and president of the East Town Lake Citizens Neighborhood Association, and a housing commissioner with the city's Neighborhood Housing and Community Development Department. So she wears a lot of hats. She has been engaged in preserving and defending Edward Rendón Sr. Metropolitan Park at Fiesta Beach, named in honor of her grandfather and better known to the neighborhood simply as Chicano Park. Next, Harrison Eppright is a lifelong East Austin resident with deep family roots in the area, manager of visitor services for Visit Austin, the city's tourist bureau. And he's also the best known and most historically knowledgeable tour guide. He serves a similar role as a docent for Six Square, the nonprofit that promotes East Austin's Black Cultural District, roughly coinciding with the Black neighborhood memorialized in Faultlines, and represented in Eppright's own biography. In January, Harrison told the Austin American-Statesman that Austin is more than the sum of its parts. And in the words of reporter Michael Barnes, Harrison David Eppright embodies Austin history every day. So we've got a great panel right now. And before I get to John, I want to talk a little bit. He asked me to set the historical context a little bit. And so I'll spend a little time doing that, especially for people who might not know the geography in Austin. Obviously I won't rehearse the entire history, but in the forward, I talk about three defining decades in the history of East Austin. And the sections that we're talking about were essentially created by Jim Crow. And that was in the 30s. It began with the city's so-called master plan, the ill-named 1928 city plan that was described as devoted to reducing racial tensions, but doing that by basically moving all people of color to one district in the East Side, and that's the district that is featured in Faultlines that runs, is bounded on the west by what is now I-35, which was then East Avenue. And runs roughly from what is now Martin Luther King Boulevard, 19th Street, all the way down to the Colorado River, but also bifurcated by ethnic distinctions. The north end of that, from 19th Street down to 7th or 6th, was roughly the African-American neighborhood. And then below that, from 7th or 6th on down to the river, 2nd and 1st Street, which is now Cesar Chavez, the Mexican-American or Latino neighborhood. So, and it was initially obviously a segregationist policy with obvious segregation intention, but as a couple of the essayists in John's book, Wilhelmina Delco and Johnny Limon, who's no longer with us, they said it had also a contradictory effect, which was to make for cohesive neighborhoods that relied on themselves and each other for culture, for support, for creating a lively sense of community. And that went on for close to 30 years. And both Delco and Limon in their essays talk about that tension. Things began to change in the 60s, the next major decade. And that when finally there were battles, civil rights battles all across the city, because people no longer accepted, okay, we're only going to belong in one neighborhood and only cross the street for business or whatever. And so that meant the end of official segregation, but it also was with its own losses, which is this sense of community that had been built up over so many years. And then finally, the last decade that I'll talk about, it really leads into our own, but 2000 to 2010, Austin has changed dramatically throughout its entire existence, roughly doubling in size every 20 to 25 years in population. And that growth, while it's kind of inevitable, has been so rapid that it just kind of overwhelms people. Even people who are comfortable with change are not necessarily comfortable with walking down the street and seeing everything different every few weeks. And so John's celebratory and elegiac photographs that were taken roughly from 2006 to 2011 are about preservation and destruction. And the ongoing changes that we'll talk about with the other folks on the panel. I'm gonna hand it over to John as the photographer, documentarian, and author of this book, but with a little bit about him. He's a founding member of the Austin Center for Photography. He took up photography when his corporate job as an attorney brought him to the Far East. In addition to his work in East Austin with the book Faultlines, Langmore is co-director, producer of the award-winning feature-length documentary film Cowboys, having spent a lot of his time as a young man and his summers as a cowboy. And that's a documentary portrait. He's author of the book Open Range, America's Big Outfit Cowboy. And his photographs have appeared in 2 major museum exhibitions, including at the Briscoe Western Art Museum. He has served on the board of Capital Metro and on state, county, and city boards. I think that's where we first ran into each other in the course of my reporting. And in an attempt to influence the way Austin evolves. And John is going to talk about how this project came to be and about his book.
Thank you, Michael, and also thank you, Bertha and Harrison, for joining us tonight. And yeah, probably, Michael, I don't know, the first time you and I encountered each other, I bet you criticized some vote I took at Capital Metro or something in the Chronicle. And Harrison and I actually go to church together in a wonderful church in East Austin. So it's great to have y'all here. And so very briefly on this project, Michael described the boundary of it, the heart of old East Austin. And what really drew me to this, I had decided I wanted to do a photographic project, which was really tell a story, really document something thoroughly, spend a lot of time on it. And what drew me to East Austin were a few things. First and foremost was the rich sense of community that existed there. And you can really, I hope you can feel it in the photographs. You could certainly feel it moving around East Austin. And for instance, this photo that Bergen just put up is of Estrada's Cleaners. And it says since 1960. So that's 61 years that Estrada's has been cleaning clothes for East Austin residents and renting them tuxedos for their formal affairs, their graduations, their weddings. There are not many parts of town where businesses operate uninterrupted for 61 years. That used to be commonplace in East Austin. People lived there multiple generations. They frequented the same businesses, and that staying in the same place for so long and for multiple generations just builds a rich sense of community that you really don't get other places. And as, so it's not just my book, because also in the book is really poignant and beautiful essays by Miss Wilhelmina Delco, kind of a legendary leader of the East Austin African American community, and Johnny Limon, sort of the same type of person, one of the longest running, most respected activists in East Austin. So they wrote really poignant essays, and they both made the point that when folks were essentially forced out of West Austin into East Austin, they didn't roll over. What they did was build a full community for themselves. With Houston Tillotson University, they could educate their children from elementary through to a college degree. And they had businesses that served East Austin residents. They had the Victory Grill with some of the best music that you could find anywhere in the country. And just a whole multitude of great restaurants, hair salons, everything they needed to be self-sufficient. And that was really impressive to me as I began to photograph there. What the book is about is the change to that community. And it's not what it's changing into. There are basically no photographs of New East Austin. It's about what it's changing from. And, change is inevitable. It's often for the better, but it comes at a cost. And in East Austin, it's come at a cost to what I think was probably, the richest and most unique communities that existed in Austin. So the book is designed to make us take stock of what we lose when things change, and especially at the pace that they are in Austin. And I will also say, it's somewhat sad to me that it's also meant to create a record of that unique neighborhood that I think is going to be gone, and not, certainly in our lifetimes, it will not be anything like it was when I started this project, much less the years before that. And it's obviously meant as a tribute to the wonderful people of East Austin. Yeah, so thanks, Michael.
Thank you, John. Let's draw the other folks into the discussion now. I thought one thing, since you both, Bertha and Harrison, have been longtime residents of the area that we're talking about, why don't you just try to give briefly your perspective on those neighborhoods, and also how much they have changed over the last 20 years or so, and the effects on community there. Obviously, we've all seen it to one degree or another, but you've seen it from the inside. Bertha, you want to start us off?
First of all, I want to thank Mr. King, John, the panelists, Mr. Harrison, everyone that's participating today. Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I have the book right here, and I had the honor to meet John years ago when he was photographing this. And just to look back at the photos right now and reflect on what was our neighborhood, what was our barrio then, and what it is now, and having had lived through that and still here in the year 2021 has been devastating. I am looking at the slideshow right now, and tears are running down my eyes because it is that emotional, that the photos that were captured then will never be able to be captured again. Those are photos of a lifetime. Those are historical photos. I want to just share that many of our families, Brown and in the Black community, we have not had any guidance at all, any protection. We've asked questions as of, where do we go now? How are you going to raise our schools? How are you going to raise our parks? How are you going to raise our homes, our families? What do we have left to share with our children and our grandchildren and the future to come? Nobody's answered those questions. We've had to wake up every day and witness a home being demolished that belonged to our family or a friend. We've had to wake up and witness people moving in here and them not understanding who we are and what we represent. So many of us are still here, and I kind of feel like we're in a cubbyhole, and there's this whole world around us that's growing and moving, but we're stuck in here with not knowing what's going to happen next. We have to figure out, how are we going to maintain living here with the taxes rising so high? We have to figure out, how could we sustain our culture here economically? We have to figure out, how do we keep generational wealth? And we have all of these things to figure out with no assistance from our officials or from any type of education institute that's coming in here to assist so many of us that are still left here in East Austin. And so it's been heartbreaking and traumatizing, I think, for many of us that are just trying to preserve the little of what's left here in our community. And I have a lot to say, because it's emotionally, heartbreaking to me. I'll go ahead and let Mr. Harrison chime in.
Yeah, Harrison, your thoughts on that transition?
Sure, and go off mute, Harrison.
Yeah, I got it. Go off the mute. There you go.
Thanks. Thank you. Yes, anyway, yes. Good evening, everybody. And I want to thank you, Michael, and I want to thank you, John, and Ms. Bergen for inviting me to participate in this webinar. And thank you, Ms. Bertha, for your participation. And this is my first time meeting you. So I'm very happy for that. And I think it's the first time that I'm meeting you too, Michael.
That's right.
Yeah, John and Ms. Bergen, I think the same thing. John and I, we do worship at the same church, St. James Episcopal Church in East Austin, and I am a native East Austinite as well. But for me, in drawing on what you said, Bertha, it's in drawing on what you said about how there really are no guidelines for what we are to do next. Well, that's basically, you could say, that's kind of like a continuation of the 1928 master plan. There really were no guidelines for how putting these two ethnic groups, in the same area, living side by side or within blocks of one another, or we pretty well had to figure it out ourselves, and then we still find ourselves having to do that. I'm in the position of, we are selling my mother's house. My mother passed last year, and we 4 children are going to sell the house that has been in the family for 60 years in a neighborhood that is vastly changing, a neighborhood that was originally built in 1958 as Greenwood Heights, and it was built for working class Black people, working class, lower middle class Black people, and the 40 houses on this street, mostly small houses. Our house and a few others were exceptions. Our houses were large houses, but they were nice, well-built houses. And the most expensive house on the street was $13,500, the price that my parents paid for their house back in '61. And that was a move up from us. We were getting out of the old Booker T. Washington housing projects, and the old Booker T. Washington projects looked a lot like the Rosewood projects, the Rosewood Courts projects. So we were getting out of that and moving really, I guess, into the suburbs of East Austin in Greenwood Heights. And today, 61 years later, because the house actually was built in '60 and wasn't purchased until '61, half of the houses, or let's say certainly half of the houses have been renovated and modified, some expanded, some houses have been torn down, and new 2-story houses have been built in this area with an additional house in back. And now the street has changed so that there are houses that are going up directly behind the backyard of our place that we are trying to sell, and duplexes going up the street. Anyway, the point is that I cannot afford to live in the neighborhood where I grew up. I can't afford to live there. So it's and so we're selling the house, and it is going to provide enough money for certainly to further finance my retirement, but which is a good thing. But yes, but there is something that is being lost in that. There are very few neighbors whom I remember from childhood living on Greenwood Avenue. Fortunately, the longest serving neighbors on Greenwood, who have been on Greenwood since 1958, they are not going anywhere soon, God willing, and they will be among the last original members on Greenwood. But anyway, yes, gentrification comes with mixed blessings. That I can certainly see some good that has come from it in more diversity and more choices. Because I mean, back in the day, certainly, especially in the Black community, back in the day when you had rigid racial segregation and you had businesses in the Black community of East Austin, and it was a bit more self-sustaining than it is now. There were still those businesses started to fold after desegregation became a reality, after open housing became a reality, starting in the late 1960s and continuing into the 70s and into the 1980s. And so we started to see a drain of African Americans from East Austin for various reasons. And I don't fault open housing at all. I do not fault that at all. I am a racial integrationist, but I do see the unintended consequences of racial integration, and how for so many people today there is a sense of, for those who still remain in East Austin, a sense of where is the community? Is there anything for me? I've dealt with African Americans in East Austin who have told me there ain't nothing left in East Austin for us. Well, there's still a lot of cultural touchstones in East Austin, in the African American and in the Mexican American community. I'm glad that I'm able to eliminate that. And to John's book, looking through your book, Faultlines, it was like almost every page of the book, I could smell the neighborhood. I could smell the barber shop. I could smell the dry cleaners. I patronized Estrada Cleaners for many years. I used to get my hair cut at Marshall's barber shop. In fact, Marshall's was a Mr. Marshall, who started it. Ira Marshall was a distant relative of our family on my mom's side. Just so many things. The church, the King Tears Mortuary, Houston-Tillotson University now, formerly Houston-Tillotson College. Well, I've done work with the people over at Houston-Tillotson, and it's a choice of really a place of pride in the community, and it's a multicultural, historic HBCU, historic Black college and university, but open for all people, which it always has been. And that's the thing about East Austin. Even though East Austin, the east part of the city, became, in my youth, it was predominantly African American and Mexican American. It was never closed. It was never like, well, unwelcoming the people who were not African American or Mexican American. There were many non-Mexican Americans and African Americans who patronized the Victory Grill on East 11th Street when that was considered part of Black downtown, or went to the Charlie's Playhouse, another incubator of music here in the community. It's very important to know these things.
That's one point that Wilhelmina Delco makes in her essay, that she would never try to put a wall up between the rest of the city and East Austin, because she said that's exactly what was done to us.
Yes.
In hearing both of you talk about it, it occurred to me that in some ways the histories of the two peoples, or the two communities, has diverged somewhat, in that the numbers of African Americans living in East Austin, or Austin generally, primarily because of economic reasons, have diminished, and not just in percentage terms, but in absolute numbers over the last decade or so, which is a surprise in a growing city. While on the other hand, in the Mexican American community, the numbers continue to grow. What difference do you think, where did the two communities start to diverge, or are there distinctions between the responses to the changes that we've been talking about between the two communities? Bertha?
Well, I I want to say, that the two communities started, I mean, first of all, you're looking at an area that was 100% population Black and Hispanic. And when you see the numbers go, down, as far as, you can see the numbers when the voting happens, when we start getting people out to vote, the numbers are there in the boxes and the precincts. That's what I started to notice. That was years ago. But when you mention economics, and that's correct, because of the fact that it's historically known that brown and Black individuals are economically disadvantaged. Most of us don't have a college education. Most of us don't come from wealth. We are the poor and the working class population. That's when you start seeing, okay, economically, first of all, people can't afford to live in East Austin because of the taxes that rose after the power plant was closed. People don't understand that it was an infrastructure and a business deal that occurred for the gentrification to exploit us. They exploited, it was exploited gentrification that came in rapidly. As I saw that the Black community was can barely hold on, and as they were being displaced, the Mexican community was right on the side being displaced too. And even though our numbers were growing citywide, statewide, our numbers weren't growing in East Austin. The ownership of people, Mexicans owning homes and Blacks owning homes, those numbers were going down. And so people were, I remember during election time, they were, oh, well, the Mexicans are going to be the majority, the Mexicans, they're outnumbering, us. But maybe we were going to be the majority, or we still are, but economically we're not. Economically, we're deprived. Economically, we don't have land. We don't own businesses. We're not invested in corporations. We're not economically where we need to be. And so we're losing at the end of the day in our historical districts. District 3 is and District 1 and District 2. Those are the three districts that are in the eastern crescent of I-35, which were predominantly brown and Black communities and the poor and the working class. As you see each district, each council member that represents each district, as you start seeing how the districts are changing as they coincide together, you'll start seeing that all of the numbers when it comes to brown and Black are not, it just doesn't make sense. Our numbers are not making sense. And again, that kind of scares me, because when you start seeing more brown and Black people be displaced out of the county, Travis County, and then out of the city, then you're going to start seeing that when it's time for voting for, elected officials, district members, judges, you're going to start seeing that the population is going to change, because people are no longer going to be here to be able to vote in Travis County. And so that's another conversation. But I look at the statistics and the numbers when it comes for people who are resident owners and renters. And it's just, the numbers are just totally off. And we have to figure out a way to sustain brown and Black people in Austin, Texas. Even if East Austin is not a home for them, they're still being displaced out of the city. And so we need to keep an eye on that.
And I should just mention something, Michael, here for the sake of some folks that might not live in Texas. We don't have a state income tax, and that's, held up as an attractive aspect of Texas. The other side of that coin, of course, is that, we still have to fund, infrastructure and everything else that lets the city run. So it's done through property taxes, since we don't have an income tax, and our property taxes are high by national standards. And so, it really accelerates the dynamic that Bertha and Harrison have been experiencing, in that you live in a home, you've lived there your entire life, and you don't change your home, you haven't grown your income, you're still living the same life you've lived for decades, and yet the change that's occurring around you causes your taxes to rise dramatically. And it really is like an accelerant for, the dynamic that really underlies the book.
It's a good point. Before we get too far away from the book into these big political issues that drive all of us crazy in Austin, I'd like the panelists, John, as well as Bertha and Harrison, to talk about the community scenes that are represented in the book. I mean, it's everything from I don't know, Sunday morning breakfast to Juneteenth, to just people on the street, to oddly historical kind of rural scenes, people on horseback, even some elephants. I remember when I first saw the photographs, where do those elephants come from? So before we get too far away from that, can you talk a little bit about just growing up in that community and how it differs from the community today? I mean, we're all like crazy fast, high pressure, everybody's Zooming. What was it like growing up in that community? Harrison?
Well, thank you. For me, growing up in that community, it was the community where you knew you called people ma'am and sir. It was not considered subservient to say ma'am or sir. I still said sir to my father until he died. I said ma'am to my mother, and she died just last year. And I still say that. And a lot of people, more people said it then than they do now. I hope it's making a comeback. But anyway, so it's just that everybody knew your name, or the neighbors watched out for each other. So that was a rather comforting feeling. Or the fact that if you went to church on a Sunday, and in so many Black Baptist churches, the sermons tended to be extremely long, but I would excuse myself to go out and play, usually, and be outside the church. This was before I became an Episcopalian, and there would usually be some child outside whom I could run around with. And that was always fun. But also too, just the fellowship in the church. It was an extension of the community. So I felt a sense of home, even if I could not stand the length of the services. I really appreciated that. In the schools, being a teacher was a source of pride. If you were in the African American community, being a teacher was you were near the top of the social ladder. And our teachers had great respect for our teachers. Our teachers were extremely strict on us, but I think most of the time it came from a sense of love, and they communicated with the parents or with the guardians about the child, and they also pulled us aside and spoke to us. But I guess I remember the Saturday afternoons going to the Harlem Theater that existed on East 12th Street. East 12th Street and East 11th Street were part of Black Downtown. Harlem was just down the street from the barbershop where where my father took me, Marshall's Barbershop. Harlem Theater, no Jim Crow in Harlem Theater, because also when I was a little boy, there was still Jim Crow up until 1963, 64. Movie theaters downtown, Blacks could not go to movie theaters downtown unless they went to the old Ritz Theater. And then we sat on the balcony. The Ritz was on East 6th Street. Now that's Alamo Draft House at the Ritz. But that used to be just the Ritz Theater, and we always sat in the balcony, and my parents never explained to us why. But when we went to the Harlem Theater, which we understood was catered to Black people, well, then we could sit anywhere we wanted to sit. And a great joy was going to the Harlem Theater on a Saturday afternoon for a movie, and then our parents joining us later that night for a movie as well. Or we would go someplace and order takeout somewhere. I remember that because of racial segregation, and these are things that I couldn't really understand as a kid, but I certainly understand it better as an adult. I noticed that you had your rich, your middle class, your strivers, your ne'er-do-wells. They all live, if not side by side, they live within blocks of one another. So you had a lot of examples to look at. We talk about this thing about role models. Well, we definitely had a lot of role models or examples. So we knew full well which path to take if we wanted to. So that was one of the things about those days that I remember.
Bertha, how does that compare to your memories of growing up on the East Side?
Well, they align as almost the same, except we were two different generations here. I grew up in the 1980s and in the 90s. I'm 41 years old. And so my memories are a little bit different. But it was so much like Harrison said, like we were like family, community, like family. It was like our own little city here. We had our own HEB. We had our movie theater on Riverside. We had our own park. We had our own schools. We had our own haircut places. We had Freddy's. Everyone went to Freddy's to get their haircuts and their perms. But it was a different time. And that time there were gangs. There was a lot of gangs. So East Austin was a very territorial area. And in that times, and I mean, that was across the nation here, gangs were a big thing. And so our area was not beautiful. And I can't say I grew up in a beautiful neighborhood because I didn't. I'm sorry. I grew up in a neighborhood that was full of industrial factories. Pepsi Cola was running when I was little on Cesar Chavez. Budweiser was running on off of I think it's Comal and Fifth. Arnold's Oil was here on East 6th Street. So we had an oil industrial plant in that neighborhood right itself. Going down from all the way to East 7th, every industrial factory you can think was there. All the way to 6th to 5th to 4th, all the way to 2 blocks from my home, which was the Holly Power Plant, which we couldn't even hear any silence or any bird at all, because all you heard was a buzzing noise all day long, 24/7. The sky was not beautiful with, birds and all of this pretty skies. You saw gray smoke, we were around pollution. So, I grew up in a time where we were poor, and everybody around me was poor too. So I didn't feel like I was not normal. I felt like we were normal because we were all poor. I felt that we could go and to each other's homes and feel safe and eat at each other's homes. We were, the Guerreros were right there. The Martinezes were right here. The Rendons are right here. The Montoyas are right here. Everyone knew their family, their house by their family. And there was 5 families per block. So every area had different families. So if you're gonna ride your bike, oh, I'm going to East Second. Okay, well, make sure to go to your tia's house right there. So, and then if I needed to go to my tia's house before it got dark, I would go to my tia's house. That's the type of neighborhood we were in. We took care of each other. But
No, go
it
ahead,
was
Bertha,
it was
please.
not nice. It was not a nice neighborhood. It was very rough growing up. We had to grow up, and our goal was to make it out of here and be successful, because anybody that stayed here, either you were just going to be another statistic, or you were going to never be nothing, because we were labeled already before we were even born. Okay, go ahead.
Now, Harrison, were you fixing to say something?
Yeah, and I think that is one of the reasons why, when racial integration came in, I mean, I'm older than you are, Miss Bertha. I was born in 1955, so I can remember.
You're a youngster.
The segregation, and I remember too that that in the Black community, when I was a little boy, maybe half of the streets in Black East Austin were paved. In Mexican East Austin, probably a quarter of the streets were paved. And also too, the land in Mexican East Austin was more prone to flooding where you were. And also too, something else, I don't know if I think this was gone by the time you were born, but there used to be these oil storage tanks on Airport Boulevard, down Airport Boulevard to Go Valley, and near East 7th Street, and near the old Allen Junior High School, which was on Gonzalez Street, where I went to junior high, and not too far from the old Albert Sidney Johnston High School as well. So it was quite a different time, but I do share with you that sense of family, that sense of, even if you were, even if you weren't rich, or even if you were poor, if you will, you were certainly rich in familial connections, and a sense of feeling that you belonged somewhere, to something that was bigger than you were, that included you, as big as you. It was in you, and it was outside of you as well.
And I will say, Johnny's essay is entitled La Familia, and it talks about not only his extended family, growing up through multiple generations in East Austin. His mother passed away in the same home she had always lived in when she was 104. And, I'm so glad y'all are here, because it's the firsthand account of East Austin that really matters. And this, book is a tribute for you and all of the other people that have lived there. I was merely I'm an outsider, and I never want to, purport to be anything other than an outsider that was, given the privilege of, being invited into these places. And I will say that, I do think that the adversity that y'all face, living next to the Holly Power Plant, the tank farm, all of the industrial uses that nobody else wanted were put into East Austin. And, there's no question that there was adversity that existed. And, any of us that ever passed through East Austin at any point in time were aware. But it built a sense of community. There's, kind of the struggle builds something that never existed in West Austin. They do not do a procession like Cristo Rey Church does, where there are hundreds of people dressed up like the time of Christ. Someone carries the cross on their back, from Plaza Saltillo back to the church, and there are hundreds of people marching through the street, to celebrate the crucifixion and, the Christ resurrection. That didn't happen in West Austin. That there was never any adversity to this level there. And so it's kind of the strange irony of having to live through all that, but what, it turns into something positive and powerful. And I think, the clearest example is, or the clearest manifestation of this is, it was all 4-foot high chain link fences in old East Austin. And that means, you walk up and talk to people over the fence. You see what they're doing behind the fence. You see what they're doing on the outside of the fence. You look at all the new homes, they're all 7-foot high privacy fences, made of concrete. And that's, only to make the point that there is a big difference in terms of the sense of community that came with that struggle. That's my impression of it. I felt, again, just such a strong sense of community.
Well, John, I want to tell you that your book literally highlights all of those photographs that represents family. Johnny Limon, rest in peace. He passed away and he wasn't even alive to sit here in this panel to share what he shared to you years ago when you did that. So I think that preservation is one of the most key elements for Austin natives like us here in East Austin, is how to preserve our culture, our identity, and where we come from. I don't want to be erased. I don't want my mother and her history. She's the same age as you, Mr. Harrison. And my mother went to Johnson. And she has so many memories, just like Mr. Harrison does, just like I do, just like so many of us do. And we should not be robbed for that because of our property value or because our land is beautiful now and you want it. I feel that we should be a part of this growth. And I really hope that, even though we've had to embrace the gentrification, that we be a part of the growing growth of Austin and East Austin. I feel like we should not be left out. I feel like we've been robbed already enough. And I feel that if we are economically a part of this growth in our district and in East Austin, that we can at least go back and share the stories, preserve, sustain the families. Like I said, generational wealth, continuing to keep generations here and buying up the blocks and bringing businesses back. We lost a lot of businesses on East 6th Street. I think we only have one Mexican restaurant on East 6th Street, and that's at the Mala House that's left, when it was at one time 100% minority owned. Cesar Chavez is right behind them. Luckily, we have Mission Funeral Home that's been there over 60 years. Luckily, we have Mr. Natural that's been there for many years. But some people would tell you, like Mr. Harrison's generation, there used to be Johnny Boys, where there was like the best burgers in town. Mm-hmm. And you would be able to come up to Cesar Chavez and get them. We've lost Galunga's Body Shop on Cesar Chavez. They moved it to 7th. So we just continue to keep losing over and over and over. We lose businesses, we lose homes, we're losing. So I really hope that, the book that you created and that people would purchase it and they will go back and imagine what it was back in 2000, 2005, all the way up until now, and really reflect on who we are. And we're still here, and really try to preserve what's left. Because us activists and advocates and, businesses are still here in East Austin, and we don't want to leave. Many of us don't want to sell. Well, and good. Even though, we're facing $1 million homes here, we don't want to leave. We love it here. We love the quality of life here. But like John said, are you really our neighbor? And is this really a family neighbor when you built a fence or a cement block fence where we can't even see you? we don't even know who's living across the street from us or what country or what state you come from. How do we bridge that? And how do we engage here in our city moving forward? I have those questions to elected officials. I'm still waiting on answers.
Well, I think that question is one that troubles everybody in Austin because the change has been so dramatic and so fast, but obviously very, very dramatic and fast in the neighborhoods we've been talking about. I think we're going to have to leave it there because we're running out of time. So I want to thank everybody for joining us, especially our panelists. Thank Trinity University Press. And if you would like to purchase a copy of Faultlines, you can visit tupress.org. That's TU-Press, all one word, .org, and use the promo code Maverick04, Maverick04, all one word, at checkout for 20% off. A portion of the proceeds of these books goes to support local Austin neighborhood nonprofits. I think every nickel that John has earned has gone to one of those. The Maverick Book Club is a bi-monthly series of virtual Zoom discussions, maybe one day in person again, featuring intriguing authors discussing the books that are shaping the narrative landscape of the state. Next month, join them for American Venice, a conversation on San Antonio's Riverwalk with author Louis Fisher in conversation with the director of Confluence Park, Frates Seligson, Irby Hightower from Alamo Architects, and others discussing the Riverwalk's legacy, past, present, and future. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate having this conversation.
Please,
May I say
Harrison.
one thing? May I say one thing?
Sure.
I'm really optimistic, believe it or not, about East Austin, about our multiculturalism, and I do like the new energy that I'm seeing, especially on East 11th Street and on East 12th Street, and how it is becoming a place where you have a lot of artists, you have a lot of what's been done, like down around Rosewood at that overpass at Rosewood Park. There are now murals painted on those pillars at that overpass. That it shows you that there are things that are happening, that there is a new sense of time, place, and neighborhood, recording the past as well as taking into account the present. So I'm very encouraged by that.
And I would add that that is only because of the effort of people like you, Harrison, and you, Bertha, that it is that we can all feel positive about East Austin, and y'all, I know, will keep up the good fight to make sure that the wonderful history of the most unique part of Austin, for sure, is not forgotten and is not lost. And that is so critical and so important. And I'm so thankful that y'all are doing what you do. And Michael, all your great writing about the whole of Austin and East Austin in particular, you've kept this community informed, in a very intelligent way. And you've made us wrestle with the issues that are important to our city. So thank you, everybody, for attending. And thank you all for joining us on the panel. I look forward to seeing you all very soon.
Call me back. I'd love to. Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.